for tuning into another episode of G.E.N Talks podcast, where the goal is to empower the youth of Glendale and connect youth to community resources, individuals, and organizations through interviews and discussions. I'm your host, Melissa.
And I'm Desiree. And we had the pleasure of talking to Grace Shim. Grace grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma as one of 2 Korean Americans at her high school. Her sister was the other one. Today, Grace writes books with Korean American protagonists that she wished she had read about as a teen, including the acclaimed The Noh Family. When she's not plotting, the writing kind, not the world domination kind, you can find her wearing a Korean sheet mask, baking French macarons, and unintentionally killing houseplants and succulents. She lives in the Bay Area with her husband and 3 kids. We hope you enjoyed this interview.
Thank you, Grace, for taking the time out of your day to talk with us. We have a lot to discuss.
Of course, I'm so excited to be here.
So to start off the interview, you grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. What was your experience like living there, especially as one of 2 Korean Americans there?
Yeah, I did grow up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, like my character. And you know, I try to infuse a lot of that in the character that I wrote. But when I grew up in Tulsa, I was actually born there too. So for much of my life, I didn't know anything else. And I think when that realization came that obviously I was different if I was one of just a handful of Asians at my school, but I think the reality really hit me when I switched schools around 7th or 8th grade. I can't remember. I think it was 8th grade. And when I did that, I had to recalibrate. And at that school, I was really one of 2 Koreans, because it was a private school, so it was much smaller. And my sister was the other Korean American, so it's not like we had a community. But I think it really did make me reflect on what made me feel different at a different school, and what made my transition there a lot less smooth than another person who transferred the same year, who wasn't Korean American or who wasn't POC. And I think it really was isolating, and it really, I think, though I may have felt different my whole life living there, I think it really impacted me in a deeper way in middle school. And so, I think it was definitely helped shape and inform a lot of my ideas of what it was to be a Korean American, and to also, have later on in life deal with the idea that, I had a lot of internalized racism that I was battling later on as a young adult and, even into my adulthood.
What was your relationship with books and writing in general?
Oh, that's a good question. So I loved writing. I actually did really excel, I think, in, not to be anti-stereotype, but I do always like to point it out. I was not one of those like super math, have math accelerated Asian kids. Though I did okay in math, it was not something that was like clearly something I excelled in. It was actually reading and writing. And I did do really well with my writing assignments. And I think part of the problem with, growing up though, in an Asian American family, is that writing is never really considered a viable career option. So I always just saw it as a tool to help me get, the assignments done or to get me the next step in education, but not really anything that I could use as a practical career in the future. So I did gravitate towards writing as a young child. Now, reading was really interesting because, I think there's more characters that look like, me in books for the young audience today. But when I was growing up, there certainly wasn't anything like that. And an interesting writing memory that I have was when I was in 9th grade, I wrote, I think we did memoir or something. We did some kind of like personal writing, and I wrote about my dad's experience growing up in Korea during the war. And the first thing my teacher said to me was, "Oh, this is very Joy Luck Club." Like he compared it to like really the only other Asian Asian book, mainstream Asian book in the US market. And so that's pretty much what it was growing up, that was our own baseline for writing Asian stories. So as you can imagine, growing up here in Oklahoma, I didn't really have any connections to thinking, oh, I could write the next, Asian American book. Like, it was never something that I aspired to do from a young age.
And do you remember when the first thought of you considering wanting to become an author happened?
I do. I went back to school to be, I think like when I was like 24, I went back to grad school to pursue my master's in early childhood education. And I wanted to teach young kids, so pre-K through second. That was my sweet spot. And one of our assignments, I went to this really small, it was a small intensive program that condensed my master's program in teaching education in 1 year. So we had this small cohort of like, I want to say 10 graduate students, and we all came from different walks of life, and some were straight out of college and some were parents, and I was somewhere in the middle. But one of our assignments was to present ourselves as, multiple different aspects of our lives. I can't even remember how this tied to the curriculum, actually, when I think about it. But I was teaching kindergarten, and kindergarten is a grade where books are often used to tie in a lot of themes, especially picture books. And I was doing my student teaching in kindergarten. So one of the themes in kindergarten was all about me. And I thought it was really appropriate for me to maybe make a big board book of all about me. And it was about me. So I, story about myself with no seriousness in mind. I was literally trying to do this project, and I illustrated it simply, and it was pretty large, and I presented it to the group, and I remember it being such a big hit. Again, I was just doing the assignment. I wasn't really looking for writing encouragement. I was looking to get a good grade on this assignment. And the director pulled me aside, and she was like, "You should really think of writing children's books." And I was like, okay, sure. I'm here literally trying to get my master's in education and teach kids, not write kids' books. But, I think as time went on, that really planted a seed in me, and it grew and it developed. And it wasn't until recently meaning like 5 or 6 years ago, that I actually had the thought in my head that maybe I should really try this, and took a stab at it.
So going into the publishing world, what was that journey like for you?
Long, because I do know, and the more authors you talk to, I'm sure you hear so many different stories about how people have gotten into publishing their first books and whatnot. And in my head, I feel like it was like the longest journey, but I'm sure it's really not that long relative to some other authors as well. But like I said, I had the idea maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and really I had to have all of my career options taken away from me to even consider it too, because at that point I just had my third child. I had decided to be a stay-at-home mom because I felt like my specialty was with young children, and I thought, I'm having my own kids, I should be with them while they're young. So, by your third one, you're with just that's all I have day in and day out. I have my kids, and I felt like I needed something for myself. I didn't have, I was so far from being in a classroom. I hadn't been in one in so long, and even further from being at a desk job or, a real career. And so really all I had was my ideas in my head. And I do think that the stories, and it's not really, I get a lot of questions about like, oh, are you an avid reader? And, I do like to read, but I think more than my love of reading, fueling my passion for writing is my love of stories. I just love to like think of stories because, and I don't mean to scare off parenthood or make it seem like I hate being a parent, because there's absolute joys to it, but a lot of it, especially when they're younger, is so monotonous, and it's just, you're in your head all the time. You have to create something, stimulating for yourself. Otherwise it becomes really just, tiresome, day in and day out tiresome. So I did have a lot of stories that I thought like, oh gosh, this would be amazing, you know, obviously in my head. Anything would be amazing to me at that time. But I did really have an inspiration for this story, and I was like, I'm gonna write it and see where it takes me. And you know, it was one of those moments where I was running before I knew how to crawl or walk. So I just like vomited the story out on a Word doc that just went on for pages. And I had a story with pretty much no plot and some character development, but you know, it was so fun for me to have something to look forward to and to get into like other people's minds and live their lives. And I think it was an escape for me at first. And then the more I learned about it, the more I realized, oh, there's so many steps I need to take, and so many people who have been like classically trained, or, you know, by going to school and having an undergraduate degree in it and doing it for years. And I'm coming in at it at a really amateur perspective. So I think that was just a fun like activity to kind of get my feet wet. But what really I felt like I really needed was a crash course in it. So I then started to look into mentorship programs that were online. I didn't really have time. And also I got the feedback that it wasn't really necessary to go back to school, you know, to pursue this. I mean, it was something that you could do if you wanted to, but it's not a prerequisite or requirement to be an author. So I didn't necessarily have that time, but I felt like a mentorship would have been a great way for me to get, you know, kind of like a crash course in it. And so I did my first mentorship. I submitted for my first mentorship program, which was Author Mentor Match. And I got in round 4. And then 2 years later, I did Pitch Wars, which was also amazing.
And could you talk a little bit more about the inspiration behind your debut novel?
So like I said, I did the 2 mentorship programs. The first one was for a manuscript that, nothing happened to that one. It went into the manuscript graveyard, but, you know, oftentimes I talk about that manuscript as the manuscript that taught me how to write. You know, I finished writing it without knowing, I think, based off of what I knew from reading and, you know, watching stories on, you know, different mediums like TV and movies. So I just wrote that story. And then through that, I learned that, you know, I needed to have more character development and stakes and plots and things like that. So I learned a lot about story structure through that. My second book that I entered Pitch Wars with, so that had a lot more craft involved in it. And Pitch Wars is no longer a thing now, but at the end of Pitch Wars, there's an agent showcase. So the end goal of that is to get an agent, with which in traditional publishing, they don't accept submissions generally without having an agent. So that's the first step to getting published. Yeah. So there are obviously other ways you can publish, self-publish, or go to a smaller press. But if you wanted to be published, especially at a, you know, major house, an agent is pretty much the first step to getting your foot in the door. And so after having a lot of, you know, excitement and hype over the initial pitch of my book, that also did not get picked up by any agents. And so it was I was really kind of like, you know, I hit this crossroads of, am I going to work on this, or am I going to maybe give up, or do I keep working, or what do I do? Right. And then that was the year, because that was February 2020 when I was trying to get an agent, which, as we know, that, you know, I think March 2020 is a very like ingrained in everyone's heads as a pivotal moment in our lives now. But I just everybody pulled back, and it was a good time for me to take a break. Publishing kind of was just really unstable, and during that time, my sister actually had taken a 23andMe test for fun. And you know how those work out, you know. So and surprisingly enough, we did get an email, or she did get an email from someone who was like, "Hey, we're relatives," and we had no idea who this person was. So that was sort of the inception of where the idea of the Noh family came from. We did discover these relatives that we've never met before, but it's definitely not that shocking. It was just someone who we never met, but when we brought it up to my parents, they're like, "Oh yes, we know who these people are." But as I said, I love stories and the potential of and my mind was already racing about, oh my gosh. And it was a time when I was watching a lot of Korean dramas too. So naturally my head kind of was like, oh, can you imagine if, this happened, then this happened. And my sister was no help because she was fueling me. She was like, oh my gosh, yeah, and this and this and this. And she knew I was struggling with my other manuscript. So she's like, put that aside, write this. And I wrote The Noh Family, which is my debut novel, which, for those who haven't read it, is about a girl who takes a 23andMe test and discovers family she never knew about. Ooh, that sounds very, very familiar, right? And I wrote that in 2 months, and I revised it in 1 month. And I then pitched it on DV Pit, which is a pitch contest on Twitter. And I got a bunch of interest from agents. And then 2 weeks later, I got an agent. So after that, it went really quickly. So that was the long story that you might not have expected on how I got the Noh family out there.
And what have you learned during this whole process of becoming a published author?
I've learned, and I can, because now I've talked about my journey to publishing. I've learned that having a book being published is really not the end goal. I think because, I guess what the surprising part is that, for so long I just wanted a published book, and I remember joking about it with my writer friends, like, oh, I don't care if anyone reads it. I want it to be published. I want it to be on the bookshelves and blah blah blah. You make all these kinds of deals and bargains in your head, like no one has to buy it. It just needs to be a book that's published. But then, posts you realize keep moving, and you quickly forget about kind of what it was that you really, the accomplishments that you've made in publishing. So for so long, I just wanted that book to be published. And then when it gets released, and even leading up closer to it, you start to realize, no, I don't want just a book published. I want it to be, a phenomenal success, or I want it to be on every list, or, you have these other things that you want. And I think that's really, it's really hard to imagine when you're an aspiring author that you have feelings of letdown and moments of sadness in the process, when all you're thinking is you have a book deal, you should be happy with that. But there are definitely struggles along the way, and maintaining that excitement is often not as easy as it looks looking in from the outside. So I think for those who are aspiring writers, especially, to know that it's good to have a perspective on what you want from publishing, or what you want from the writing journey, that is more sustainable than just that one book deal, because that one book deal is as great as it is, and I'm not going to downplay it, it really is pretty pivotal moment in my life and most authors' lives. It's really not enough to sustain you as a writer to keep fueling your inspiration and motivation to keep writing.
What do you hope readers feel whenever they read your book or any future books by you?
I really hope they feel some sense of connection to the story, whether or not it's a feeling of being a fish out of water, because that's often something that I felt growing up. So that's a theme in that will be a theme in all of the books that I write, just because that's the place of authenticity that I can write. And I really hope that if people who don't identify themselves with the way my main character looks, maybe they can identify with the main character in the way that they feel. And being a fish out of water doesn't necessarily mean being like a minority group. It can also just feel like, just not fitting in, and that's something that's a universal feeling with teens all around the world. And not just feeling a connection to the main character or someone in the story, but I do hope that they finish the book with a feeling of hope, joy, because at the end of the day, I want kids to know that like your darkest moments can sometimes feel like it's going to be like for the rest of your life, but like just to know that that's just a moment in your life, and there's definitely highs and lows to look, but definitely highs to look forward to.
Did you ever feel an underlying pressure to represent your community through your books?
Yes, that's a great question. I do. I think as authors, we feel like we're, and this is a lot of conversations that I'm having with other author friends that are, POC, not just Asian, but underrepresented or marginalized communities. We do often feel this amount of pressure from both ends, basically. Like, write, we want, you to write. We want more diversity, but we only want this type of diversity, like a specific type of diversity. And I'll give you an example. That book that didn't sell was, for me, that didn't get an agent, is a book about racism and about how a teenage girl wants to pursue mainstream American music, and the mainstream American music industry is not, doesn't see an Asian lead in a band being marketable, right? So it's a type of racism book. And it just was not a very, it's a book that they thought was really interesting and important, but not enough to take it on. And so I kind of felt like, okay, it has to be some type of racism book for them to want it, right? Like, so I really like something tragic. Someone has to die, or someone has to be, violent or something. So I realized very early on that they didn't want just a certain type of Asian book. They wanted, they didn't want any representation. They wanted a certain type of representative book. And so when I wrote the Noh Family, there was a little bit of resistance from myself, because I felt like they wanted a book about tropes and a book about Korean dramas, because it was very, what is it called? It was like a trend. And I think it was so popular, and Korean dramas had become so popularized at that time. I felt like that was something I was a little selling out, because it didn't feel like my typical book that I wanted to write. And so part of me was resistant to writing it, because I didn't want to write to a certain trope or a certain trend that was going on, but I couldn't resist this personal connection that I had to it. And so I really tried to put my own unique spin to it and put it out there. And I do sometimes, I have a love-hate feeling with the way the book is being pitched. If I'm being candid, the book is always being pitched as if you love K-dramas. And, I kind of cringe at that, because it's like, only if you love K-dramas are you going to like this book. And, and also like they're kind of trying to, latch onto that audience that is that wave, that K-drama wave too. So I feel like, please just read this book. If you like a good story, please read this book. Like, but it's not their fault. It's the way things are right now. So I kind of, there's an awareness factor that I understand. And then there's this feeling of just wanting to write books that aren't issues books. Like, do they always have to represent my culture? Can I just write a romantic comedy without having to insert like identity issues and race issues? But, for now, I'm glad it's part of the discussion. But I'm always going to write a book that is something meaningful to me. So that's not going to change. And I really hope that I'll still continue, I'll be able to continue to write books, and editors will want to buy books like the ones that I write. And the good news is that that book that didn't get picked up about the girl that wanted to pursue music is actually my book too. So it will be coming out, and I was able to sneak it in there, and we are having an amazingly great time. Me and my editor are having an amazing time rewriting it and, you know, getting it ready for, you know, it to come out too.
So before we end, we have some rapid fire questions. The
Okay.
first question is, what is your favorite color?
I go through seasons of colors, but right now it's green. I don't know if you guys can tell, but I do the green. I love it.
When are you the happiest?
When am I the happiest? No, I won't lie. When I have my first cup of coffee in the morning, I do feel like that's like something that fuels me, and I need it, and it just makes me feel good.
Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
In yourself, yeah, just trust yourself a little bit more. Things will be great, and just be more confident.
What is a book that you have recently read or currently reading that you would recommend?
Okay, so I was kind of surprised by how much I love this book. I knew I was going to like it, but I didn't know I would love it this much. But A Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School, because I think the author, they do such a great job of injecting relatability, humor, and just, you know, just like a lot of emotions in a lighthearted, in a easily digestible way for a teen, especially because it's a lot of heavy topics that they kind of go over. So I definitely recommend it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Grace. We learned a lot about you. Thank you for taking your time out of your day to sit down with us and talk. Can you let everyone at home know about any upcoming projects and where they could connect with you?
Yes. Like I said, my book 2 is going to be coming out. I think it did get pushed to spring 2024, though, unfortunately. So it might be a little while, but I would love for anyone to stay up to date with any updates I have on it and future projects on Instagram or Twitter. Those are the easiest ways to follow me. On Instagram, I'm G.K. Shim Writes. On Twitter, I'm Grace Misplaced 1. And also you could find me on my website. You can email me through the form on there, which is gkshimwrites.com.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much. We really enjoyed getting to know you, and thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Did you enjoy this episode? I'm sure you did. Don't forget to follow us on our socials on Facebook and Instagram at MyGlendaleLAC.
And follow us on Spotify and Apple or anywhere where you get your podcast from at G.E.N Talks. Also, make sure to give us a like and subscribe to the YouTube channel Glendale Library Arts and Culture, where we post the full video episodes every Friday at 4:30 p.m.